In this daily drop, I'm going to talk about why you might not want to do business just on a handshake and verbal communication. So let's go. Okay, brand new week here in the barn, and it's business time. And what I want to talk about today is something that I think anybody, whether they've had a long career, they're just starting out, or they're somewhere in the middle, has probably bumped into. And that's the idea of doing business on a handshake and verbal communication. I think inherently as human beings, we wish it could be that way. We wish we could just have a handshake, send an invoice, create stuff, everybody's happy with it. You know, you hop on the phone, you talk about some things, the job's done, final invoice gets submitted, Bob's your uncle. Everybody's happy. Does that happen? Not really. I mean, it can happen, but does it really happen? Not really. And we all have, and if you're at the beginning of your career, you will have war stories. You will have things that are the lessons that teach you how not to do things going forward. And while I would love all of my communication to just be verbal, while I would love to close jobs on a handshake, it's just not a good way to do business. And it creates this area, which I call the gray area. I like things that are black and white. I like things to be clear. And I think that generally the people you're working with, your clients, do as well. They don't always know that, or the way they like to work may not be exactly that way. And it becomes even more complicated nowadays with these additional layers of communication, right? We have phone-based communication. You have Zoom or Teams or Google Meet meetings. You have Slack. You have texting, SMS, all of that stuff. So many different things, not to mention email, that there's so many layers of communication that I think that can also mess things up. But at its base, what I would say is, and I've talked about my approach to projects in the past, at its base, I think the first minimum step is to talk about a project with a prospective client and then put something down in writing. It might just be a budget estimate to start with. And you might do that because you're just trying to feel out whether or not you're in the ballpark. Because before you sit down and write a full proposal that's 2, 3, 5 pages long that breaks down the entire project and is the blueprint, it might be a good idea to throw numbers out. I use a budget sheet and it helps me. I don't do that most of the time, but sometimes that's a good first step. But generally, it's a back and forth, things in writing, and I try to stick with just 1 or 2 types of communications. I'm a little bit old school. I don't mind picking up a phone. The problem with the phone or a Zoom or a Teams or a Google Meet is that unless it's being recorded, it's just verbal communication. So what I tend to do is anytime, even if we're just ramping up for a project, I want to follow up on something that is on a phone call or in a Zoom meeting or the equivalent. I will put together something in an email in writing so that there's no gray. I want black and white. I want things to be clear. I want us to all agree upon what we're trying to do. And it's a much healthier way of going about things. In fact, when I'm planning out a project with a client or a prospective client, what I like to do is write a comprehensive proposal with a budget because that becomes, as I said earlier, a blueprint for the entire project. And that's something that you can give to your client. They can look at and then say, oh, no, we wanted this, or we also want this, or can we change that and maybe have this? That's the starting point, but it's in writing, right? So you don't want to just do things with a handshake. You want to have a proper document that lays out what it is that you are delivering, creating and delivering to the client. And that takes the handshake component out of it. And then you want to consistently keep everything in writing when you're working on a project. Even if you have verbal communication or you have a meeting that's not recorded. And I don't love meetings that are recorded, but even if you have that meeting that's not recorded, follow up with an email. It's almost like when people take minutes in a meeting. It's just to recap what we talked about, blah, 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 blah. It's a paper trail. It's a way for you and the client to always have something in writing. And trust me, I cannot tell you how many times having things in writing has saved my, you know what. It really is so important. And the more thorough you can be with your proposal and your breakdown of what the project is going to be, the better. I remember a project I did eons ago, which was it was a pretty good sized project. Think of it like a smaller version of TED Talks. So many cameras, an event in a convention center. And I just laid out very, very clearly in the proposal what we were responsible for and what the client was responsible for. And as it turns out, on that one particular project, we had the client come back and say, oh, we thought you were handling and you were going to pay for event-based stuff like the chairs and the setup and all of that stuff. And I very clearly, no gray, black and white, stated in the proposal that wasn't true, and we did not have to incur that cost. If it was a gray area, and it seemed like, based on my proposal, that I wasn't covering that, or I was covering that, or however it was going to be interpreted, then you can see that's where it gets gray. So keep it black and white. Make sure that you're not doing business on a handshake. Make sure that everything, at least at some point, gets into a written form, because if it's not in writing, there's nothing to go back to. Hopefully that helps. Don't forget to, and I'll see you on the next episode of The Daily Drop.